How might peace be achieved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I've done this before. It's been requested again. I think it's worth doing every couple of years. Usually, this satisfies no one. It generates a ton of hate mail. It receives very little interest. So I don't know why I do it to myself, but in all seriousness, let's do it anyway. And my suggestion would be listen to the entire segment before commenting or writing in. That's my only request with peace and love. Now, I am going to give you some advance notice. As I lay out what I believe to be the most likely framework to even make the possibility of Israeli-Palestinian peace plausible, I am not going to be taking outrageous one-sided black and white views. So if your perspective is the West Bank and Gaza should simply be taken by Israel, then this is not going to be a good segment for you. If your perspective is Israel shouldn't even really exist, it's not a legitimate country and it should be done away with, this is not going to be a good segment for you. If your view is some extreme perspective that's completely divorced from reality, just don't even bother. I don't want to hear from you. This segment will not satisfy you. There's probably other shows better suited for that type of perspective. There are people who will be furious because this is not a bash this side or that side segment. It's what do I think is the most likely scenario to even maybe lead to a solution. And it's for people who want to think seriously about what that scenario would look like. So let's establish some foundational principles here. And the way I would suggest you listen to this is listen up until you get to a point of disagreement and then really focus in on the specifics of what I'm saying that you disagree with. Foundational principle number one, both Israelis and Palestinians deserve a state where they can live in peace. That's a pretty basic foundational principle. If we start by denying the right of existence to either Israel or a Palestinian state, we're getting nowhere. And so that gets me to principle number one. If there will be a solution, it will be a two-state solution. Those who believe that a one-state solution is the way forward, there are lots of ideological reasons why people may feel that. On both sides, that Palestinians don't deserve a state or that Israel doesn't deserve to be a state, whatever that means. I do not believe that there is even the remote chance of coming to the table for reasonable discussions unless we think about this as a two-state solution. Now, who will lead these two states, or even as a precursor to that, who will even lead negotiations? Well, a peaceful resolution is going to require leadership on both sides committed to two things: actually committed to peace and committed to compromise. In Israel, that is not going to be Benjamin Netanyahu, Likud, as evidenced by now year after year after year of seeing that it is clearly not the primary interest of Netanyahu and Likud to have peace. On the Palestinian side, Hamas, which currently controls Gaza, is not going to be a reasonable arbiter to peace. Their charter makes it clear that that's not going to be something they are going to be able to facilitate. So somehow Hamas needs to no longer control Gaza, maybe cede power to the Palestinian Authority. It's not perfect. There have been a number of conflicts, but the Palestinian Authority might demonstrate a willingness to really pursue peace as the number one goal and to compromise. So leadership in Israel, something other than Netanyahu and Likud. On the Palestinian side, it's not going to be Hamas. Just being realistic, how we get there, I don't know. Now, what about the right of return? This is a major point of contention when it comes to what will be the legal status of individuals seeking to go to Israel or a Palestinian state. There are two sides to this. On the one hand, the Jewish law of return, which means Jews can go to Israel and live in Israel and have a path to citizenship, that's going to have to be maintained. Oh, but I don't like it. We're talking pragmatically here. Okay? The whole point of Israel is a safe haven for Jews globally. And so the law of return there is going to have to be maintained. On the Palestinian side, a Palestinian right of return must be established. Now, I know there's lots of controversy over, this term, I have Palestinian origins. It's vague. How do you prove it? All these different things. I don't think we need to concern ourselves with that. That will be for the Palestinian leaders of the future Palestinian state to figure out. I don't really get why there are people who have no direct stake saying, what does it even mean to be Palestinian? They can figure out, if your family, if it's been one generation, two generations, Lebanon, whatever, the Palestinian state can figure that out. We don't need to concern ourselves with that element, but there needs to be a Palestinian right of return established. There is some practical level within which it may be unrealistic for millions and millions to return to the future Palestinian state. That's going to be for the Palestinian state to figure out. And we have seen a number of different ideas in terms of those who cannot or would not be allowed to return. Maybe there's some kind of reparation. There have been proposals put forward by figures like Ehud Barak. These are details that would be established, but some form of law of return would have to apply both to Israel and the future Palestinian state. Then we get to the borders and the territory. What would this look like? Now, whenever you mention things like, the 1947-48 proposal was close to 50-50. It was more like 55-45 in favor of Israel, but a bunch of that 55 was useless desert. So in practical terms, it was relatively even. You get people who go furiously after the concept of, why should Israel have gotten any land? It was all Palestinian land. We're not going to delve into the history, which includes it was actually British land, and it just doesn't even make sense to do that. Where are we today, and what is most likely to get us to an agreement? It's going to be, as I mentioned, a two-state solution that would largely reflect the Clinton proposed borders or some of the recent peace proposal borders. These are widely available. And so what that means is Palestinian territories would include the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem would be the Palestinian state's capital. The Jewish quarter would remain under Israeli sovereignty. There are practical and historical reasons and cultural significance, just the Jewish quarter. There are also lots of examples of when it was not under Israeli sovereignty, desecration and vandalism, etc. Now, I know for a lot of people, this will be the hangup. David, is this element or that element realistic? Or do we know that anything's realistic? We're trying to get an approximation of what it would look like. We're talking West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, with the exception of the Jewish quarter. What about settlements? I have been saying for decades, Israel should cease illegal settlement activities. Well, David, in Israel, they don't consider them illegal. By international law, we are talking about illegal settlement activities. Existing settlements either should be dismantled. I'm also not unrealistic in realizing that they will not all be dismantled. In the case of settlements that are not dismantled as part of an agreement, there should be land swaps for equivalent land areas. It can't be, here's 10 square miles of great land agriculturally and whatever, and we're going to swap where there's a settlement and we're going to swap it for some useless land. And if you look at the model for this, Yasser Arafat, the former chairman of the PLO, engaged in a bunch of negotiations and discussions where the idea of meaningful and equivalent land swaps were a possibility. So that almost certainly will be a part of it. What about security protocols? Well, this is where the devil is not in these details, but this is really the crux of a lot of this. Palestinian factions, mostly Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, must stop rocket attacks and tunnel constructions, and tunnels are going to have to be destroyed. It's just what it's going to have to be. On the other side, Gaza and the border to Gaza from Israel has to be demilitarized. The blockade has to be released. Now, both sides will likely say, if you do that, there are huge risks to everybody if the other side doesn't cooperate. Well, that's absolutely right. And so when we say that the agreement includes I'm talking zero rockets, no rockets. And if that's violated, there's consequences. The blockade is lifted. If that's violated by Israel, there are consequences. But also, if the lifting of the blockade is used to commit acts of terror, there are also consequences. This all only works, right? What's the whole point? How can we say there's already consequences? What do we mean? How is it part of an agreement? The critical element of this is that both sides need to make a binding commitment. This is critical. A binding commitment in which they renounce all future claims. You can't go a year and then either Israel puts the blockade back on, or Gazans start from Hamas or whoever starts using tunnels once again, or there's a rocket. Because all claims have been renounced and it's been agreed that we are committing that this is the deal, any future violations have to have consequences. And what those consequences are, I don't know. They would almost certainly be a return to the status quo from right now. My guess is that if in the future any side violated their side of the agreement, the other side would just go back to the status quo we have now, which is a disaster. That's the critical part. And that's what would hopefully get both sides to actually commit to it if it is considered a binding agreement. That's the framework, okay? And it's evolved a little bit over the years, but the big picture remains what it has been for some time. It won't please everybody. Everyone will bring their preconceived notions of fairness to it, but I believe that that is the closest scenario that will give us the best shot at peace. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your reactions. If you're just going to write me with just horrible attacks or whatever, just don't even bother. I don't even see it. The team is triaging the emails. You're wasting your time. Hopefully this is useful. So I wrote another book for kids. The first book was Think Like a Detective. The point of the first book was to teach kids critical thinking, which Republicans don't want them to learn, because when kids learn critical thinking, they don't vote for Republicans. The new book is Think Like a Scientist. This is a fun adventure teaching kids the scientific method. Again, Republicans aren't big on kids learning the scientific method, because when they do, they're less likely to fall for Republican lies about climate change and vaccines and so many other things. You can get the new book as well as the first one at davidpakman.com/book. This is part of the Adventures in Thinking series. Can you imagine that we're doing this? We are. davidpakman.com/book. 13,500 copies of the first book have sold. I'll bring you an update soon on sales for the second book. Think Like a Scientist. davidpakman.com/book.